Roman roads still carry us, and their laws still shape our world, but their true power was forged in war. On the battlefield, they were more than soldiers. They were architects of domination. Their strategies were ruthless, precise, and often shocking. Some didn't just win battles, they annihilated hope. The Romans turned defense into an art form with the testudo, or tortoise formation. Picture 30 soldiers moving as one unit with their rectangular scutum shields interlocked above their heads and along their sides. This created a nearly impenetrable armored shell that could deflect arrows, stones, and even boiling oil during sieges. The front row kept their shields forward while subsequent rows angled theirs upward, a simple but devastatingly effective configuration that transformed infantry into mobile fortresses. During the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Jewish defenders watched in frustration as their arrow volleys harmlessly bounced off advancing testudo formations. Ancient historian Josephus described how the Romans held their shields close together over their heads while approaching city walls, making them virtually invulnerable to projectiles. The psychological impact was immediate. Many defenders abandoned their positions upon seeing these human tanks methodically advancing toward them. But the testudo wasn't invincible. Its greatest strength became its weakness in open combat. The tight formation moved slowly, making it vulnerable to flanking maneuvers or caltrops scattered on the ground. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, Parthian horse archers exploited this by circling the Roman formation and firing at exposed legs, when the testudo inevitably broke formation under sustained harassment. A disciplined enemy could wait for fatigue to set in, then strike when shields began to drop. Yet the psychological dominance of the testudo often ended battles before they began. In Germania and Britannia, tribal warriors accustomed to individual combat frequently broke ranks when faced with this impenetrable wall of shields. The sight of an entire century moving as a single armored entity, with only the tips of gladius swords visible between shields, made many opponents reconsider direct confrontation. Modern riot police use similar shield formations for crowd control, proving the testudo's design transcends ancient warfare. The mechanics required perfect synchronization. Each soldier had to maintain exact spacing. Too loose and arrows found gaps. Too tight and movement became impossible. Front rank soldiers bore the weight of their own shield plus those covering them from behind. Rear ranks used their shields both for overhead protection and to push forward, literally driving the formation through enemy positions. This combination of engineering and discipline made the testudo one of history's most replicated infantry tactics. What made the testudo truly revolutionary wasn't just its physical effectiveness, but its psychological terror. Enemy commanders knew breaking it required perfect timing and overwhelming force. Most chose instead to withdraw rather than waste ammunition, exactly the reaction Rome wanted. While innovative, this was just one of many tactical surprises the Romans had prepared for their enemies. Their offensive formations proved equally devastating. The Roman army maintained its crushing stamina through the triple-line formation, called the triplex acies. This system divided infantry into three distinct tiers: young hastati at the front, seasoned principes in the middle, and veteran triarii at the rear. Each line had specific functions, creating a rotation system that kept pressure constant while allowing troops to recover. When the hastati tired after initial combat, they withdrew through predetermined gaps in the principes line without disrupting the formation. This cycling of fresh troops meant enemies faced an endless onslaught from Romans who were always fighting at peak condition. At the Battle of Zama, in 202 BC, Scipio Africanus demonstrated the formation's brutal efficiency against Hannibal's war-hardened veterans. The Carthaginians initially pushed back the Roman front lines, but as Hannibal's troops exhausted themselves, fresh Roman units kept entering the fray. By the time Hannibal committed his elite reserve, the triarii were still untouched. Their longer spears and decades of experience proved decisive. Polybius recorded how this system wearied the enemy by constant rotation, while preserving Roman strength for critical moments. The phrase, ad triarios redis, it has come to the triariented military terminology as the last resort when a battle hung in the balance. The formation's design allowed surprising flexibility. Between each maniple of 120 soldiers, the Romans left intervals matching their frontage. These gaps served multiple purposes. They permitted the controlled withdrawal of exhausted lines, allowed reinforcements to move forward, and could funnel enemy troops into killing zones. Unlike the rigid Greek phalanx, this system could adapt to terrain changes or unexpected maneuvers without collapsing into disorder. Commanders could even detach maniples for flanking maneuvers while maintaining the integrity of their main lines. Each soldier type carried different equipment tailored to their role. Hastati wore lighter armor to maximize mobility, while Triari bore the full panoply of a heavy infantryman. The Principes served as the versatile middle ground, experienced enough to stabilize crumbling lines, yet mobile enough to exploit breakthroughs. This graduated system ensured Rome never committed all its resources at once, always keeping fresh troops in reserve. The psychological effect was devastating. Opponents would break through one Roman line only to face another, then another. Over time, the formation evolved. Marius later abolished the distinctions between troop types, but the underlying principle of layered reserves endured. Napoleon studied Roman deployments when designing his corps system, recognizing how multiple echelons could sustain offensive momentum. The triplex acies wasn't just a formation, it was a complete battle philosophy that turned Rome into a weapon. While this system excelled at grinding down opponents, Rome also developed formations designed for sudden, shocking breakthroughs. The wedge formation became Rome's ultimate shock tactic, a human battering ram designed to crack open enemy lines. Picture a triangle of soldiers with the most heavily armored veterans at the tip, their shields overlapping as they drove forward with short, concentrated thrusts of their gladius swords. Each step increased the pressure on a single point in the enemy formation, like a chisel splitting wood. Unlike traditional frontal assaults that relied on brute force across a wide line, the wedge ignored enemy numbers entirely, focusing all its energy on creating a single catastrophic rupture. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, this tactic proved devastating against the Macedonian phalanx, a formation considered nearly unbeatable in open combat. The phalanx's strength lay in its bristling wall of 18-foot sarissa pikes, deadly against frontal attacks but vulnerable to sudden breaches. Roman legions exploited this weakness by driving wedges into gaps between Macedonian units once the rough terrain disrupted their cohesion. Plutarch described how the wedge's concentrated force shattered their ranks like a rock splitting waves. Once the phalanx broke apart, individual pikemen stood no chance against Romans trained for close-quarters combat with their deadly short swords. The wedge's success relied on precise execution. Soldiers maintained formation by keeping their left shoulders pressed against the man in front, while their right arms remained free to strike. The tip consisted of the century's strongest fighters, men who could absorb the initial clash without buckling. As the wedge penetrated deeper, the rear ranks fanned out to widen the breach, attacking exposed flanks while keeping pressure on the collapsing center. This created a domino effect. Panic spread as defenders realized their line had been cleaved in half. Few armies could recover from such a rupture. At Watling Street in 60 AD, a drastically outnumbered Roman force used wedge formations to carve through Boudicca's rebel troops despite being surrounded. Tacitus recorded how the tight Roman formations cut through the Britons like plows through soil, turning numerical disadvantage into irrelevant. The psychological shock of seeing their lines torn apart often caused entire armies to flee before the wedge reached their position. Many enemies assumed any formation that could ignore their numerical advantage must be supernatural. The wedge's influence extended far beyond Rome. Medieval knights later adopted modified versions called the boar's head formation, using the same principle of concentrated force to break infantry lines. Even Napoleon's columns borrowed elements of this tactic, proving its timeless effectiveness across centuries of warfare. While the Romans didn't invent the wedge, Thracians and Celtiberians used similar tactics. They perfected its execution through brutal discipline and training. Yet for all its terror on land, the Romans faced different challenges at sea. Controlling naval warfare required another kind of innovation, one that turned ships into something far more dangerous. Rome faced a serious problem when they fought Carthage at sea. They had no naval experience. Their solution was the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned ships into battlegrounds Romans could dominate. This wooden ramp, about 36 feet long and 4 feet wide, swung down onto enemy decks with an iron spike at the end to grip the opposing ship. Suddenly, sea battles became land battles, exactly where Rome's legionaries excelled. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, the corvus proved its worth. Carthaginian sailors, masters of naval maneuvering, watched helplessly as Roman ships closed in. Instead of dodging rams or outsailing their opponents, they found themselves locked in place by the corvus's spike. Roman soldiers poured across the bridges, turning what should have been a naval skirmish into close-quarters slaughter. By the battle's end, Rome had captured 30 Carthaginian vessels, an unthinkable outcome against the Mediterranean's premier naval power. The mechanics were simple but brutal. Mounted on the prow of Roman ships, the corvus used pulleys and ropes to swing down like a drawbridge. Once the spike embedded in an enemy deck, Marines charged across 2 abreast. This neutralized Carthage's advantages. Their skilled rowers couldn't escape, and their lighter ships became liabilities when weighed down by Roman infantry. The corvus didn't just board enemies, it trapped them. But this innovation had a critical flaw: weight. The corvus made ships top-heavy, especially dangerous in rough seas. After several Roman vessels capsized during storms, commanders realized the device worked best in calm waters. Some historians argue entire fleets were lost because the corvus impaired stability during bad weather. As Roman sailors gained experience, they relied less on the boarding bridge and more on traditional ramming tactics, but not before it helped them win key early victories. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical one. Carthaginian captains, trained for generations in naval warfare, suddenly faced an enemy that changed the rules. Instead of outmaneuvering opponents, they now had to prevent Roman soldiers from reaching their decks, almost impossible once the corvus dropped. This shock factor gave Rome an edge, even when they were outnumbered or outmaneuvered early in battles. By the Second Punic War, the corvus had largely disappeared from Roman fleets. Improved ship designs and better trained crews made boarding actions possible without the cumbersome device. But its temporary use marked a turning point. Rome had forced naval warfare onto its own terms. Modern naval infantry tactics still echo this idea of making sea battles land battles wherever possible. The corvus represented Roman ingenuity at its most pragmatic. Faced with a superior naval force, they didn't try to outperform Carthage at its own game. They changed the game entirely. Yet for all its effectiveness at sea, some of Rome's most devastating tactics weren't about force at all, but deception. The Romans turned retreating into a weapon, not because they were fleeing, but because they wanted their enemies to chase them. This tactic, known as the feigned retreat, required extraordinary discipline. Soldiers had to appear genuinely panicked while secretly maintaining their formations, all while enemy troops surged after them in what they believed was a rout. Overconfidence became the trap. The pursuing force, thinking they had victory in hand, would break ranks to chase down the fleeing Romans, only to find themselves surrounded when the Romans suddenly turned and attacked. The Romans learned this tactic the hard way. During the First Punic War near Agrigentum in 262 BC, Carthaginian general Hanno used Numidian cavalry to bait the Roman army. The Numidians charged, exchanged a few blows, then pretended to flee in disarray. The Romans, eager to capitalize on what seemed like a collapsing enemy line, pursued them straight into an ambush. Hanno had hidden his main force behind nearby hills, and when the Roman cavalry overextended themselves in pursuit, the Carthaginians closed in from all sides. The Romans lost nearly their entire cavalry unit in minutes. Rome didn't forget that lesson. By the Second Punic War, Roman commanders had adopted the feigned retreat as their own. They refined it further, using terrain to conceal reserve forces and timing the counterattack precisely. The psychology was key. Once the enemy believed they had won, they stopped thinking tactically. Their formation would scatter as troops raced ahead to claim kills or loot, making them vulnerable when the Romans wheeled around. Often, the turning point was signaled by a blast of horns or a sudden tightening of the retreating units into a battle-ready formation. The pursuers, now strung out and disordered, stood no chance against an organized countercharge. The fake retreat worked best against aggressive opponents. Germanic tribes, renowned for their fierce charges, frequently fell for it. At the Battle of Vercellae in 101 BC, Roman general Marius lured the Cimbri into a pursuit before springing his trap. The Cimbri, confident they had broken the Roman lines, raced forward, only to find themselves flanked by hidden Roman cohorts. Their momentum became their downfall. The same tactic devastated Gallic warbands, who prized individual bravery over disciplined restraint. What made the feigned retreat so effective wasn't just the physical ambush, but the mental whiplash it inflicted. Troops that moments before had been exhilarated by imminent victory suddenly faced annihilation. The shock paralyzed decision-making, turning pride into panic. Leaders who had ordered the chase now struggled to regain control as their men realized they'd been duped. Rome's greatest generals, Scipio, Caesar, Marius, all used variations of this tactic, proving its versatility across different battlefields. Centuries later, Genghis Khan's armies would perfect the feigned retreat on a larger scale, but the core concept remained the same: lure, trap, destroy. The Romans didn't invent deception in warfare, but they mastered its execution through rigid discipline and precise timing. For all their innovations in formations and siegecraft, sometimes the most effective tactic was letting the enemy think they had already won, right before proving them catastrophically wrong. Yet while ambushes could break armies, sieges could obliterate them entirely. At Alesia, Caesar engineered a trap so comprehensive it didn't just defeat an army, it crushed an entire rebellion. At Alesia in 52 BC, Julius Caesar faced a nightmare scenario, surrounded by two armies while besieging one. The Gallic leader Vercingetorix had retreated to this hilltop fortress with 80,000 troops, expecting Caesar to abandon the siege when a relief force of 120,000 warriors arrived. Instead, Caesar built two walls, one facing inward to trap Vercingetorix, and another facing outward to repel the reinforcements. This double siege became one of history's most audacious military maneuvers. The inner wall, called the circumvallation, stretched 10 miles around Alesia with towers every 130 feet. Caesar's men dug deep trenches, some filled with water to stop cavalry, while others contained sharpened stakes hidden under brush. The outer contravallation mirrored these defenses, creating a lethal no-man's land between the walls. When Gauls tried night attacks, they stumbled into pits lined with fire-hardened spikes or triggered hidden tripwires that alerted Roman sentries. The system turned geography into a weapon. Caesar even built an earthen ramp across uneven ground so siege engines could operate effectively. Vercingetorix's situation grew desperate. After 6 weeks, his cavalry ate their horses, then the troops starved. The relief army arrived too late. Their attacks broke against Caesar's defenses like waves on rocks. At one critical moment, 60,000 Gauls nearly breached the outer wall, but Caesar personally led reserves to plug the gap. Roman engineers had designed the walls with redundancy. When one section fell, attackers found themselves channeled into kill zones between secondary fortifications. The Gauls couldn't sustain momentum without food or siege equipment. When Vercingetorix finally surrendered, the outcome was inevitable. Caesar's double walls had neutralized both armies without risky open combat. Modern military academies still study Alesia as the first documented use of comprehensive siege circumvallation. The calculations were precise. Roman engineers allocated exactly 25,000 laborers to build defenses faster than the Gauls could coordinate attacks. But Caesar understood psychological warfare too. He ordered wheat stockpiled visibly within Roman lines, contrasting with the starving Gauls. When besiegers became the besieged, he rotated troops so fresh legionaries always manned the walls. Even the trap placement followed patterns. Gauls who survived one pit often stepped right into another identical one. This systematic approach broke morale as effectively as the walls broke charges. Besiegers' success relied on total control of space. Unlike typical battles where armies could retreat or maneuver, Alesia's walls made every inch contested. Caesar transformed warfare into engineering. His victory came not from brilliant charges, but from nails, trenches, and calculated starvation. The Gallic Wars ended soon after, proving nothing could outlast Roman persistence. Though elephants never threatened Caesar at Alesia, they represented another fear Rome eventually conquered. Unlike walls or starvation, These living weapons required completely different tactics and an even stranger countermeasure. If you're fascinated by the brutal genius behind history's greatest armies, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive like this one. War elephants initially terrified Roman troops. Towering over 10 feet tall and weighing several tons, these beasts trampled soldiers, gored formations with bladed tusks, and carried archers in howdahs who rained arrows from above. At the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC, Pyrrhus of Epirus unleashed 20 elephants, sending the Roman legions fleeing in panic. But Rome adapted quickly. They discovered elephants' vulnerabilities, unarmored legs, sensitive eyes, and skittish behavior. At Zama in 202 BC, Scipio Africanus countered Hannibal's elephants with wide formation gaps and light infantry, velites, who targeted the animal's eyes and handlers. The elephants charged through harmlessly, allowing Romans to flank them once they passed. Romans also used creative tactics, like flaming pigs. According to Pliny the Elder, pigs were set on fire and driven toward elephants, whose sensitive senses were overwhelmed by the squeals and flames. At the Siege of Megara, this tactic successfully panicked enemy elephants. Engineers built anti-elephant traps like hidden spike pits and deployed hot metal projectiles to burn the animal's feet. Trumpeters signaled troops when to shift formation or attack, reinforcing discipline under pressure. Fire arrows, as Josephus later wrote, could also send elephants into chaos, turning them against their own lines. Eventually, Rome fielded elephants themselves. Having mastered their use and counters, they approached the threat like modern armies handle tanks, focusing on strategy, precision, and discipline. Roman adaptability turned elephants from nightmare weapons into predictable battlefield elements, with failure punished more harshly by Roman commanders than by enemy beasts. The Roman army enforced discipline with a brutal method called decimation, executing every 10th soldier in a unit that showed cowardice or mutiny. Guilt didn't matter. Soldiers drew lots, and those who picked the marked token were beaten to death by their own comrades. This punishment left deep psychological scars and forged fear-driven loyalty. Crassus famously used decimation during the war against Spartacus in 71 BC, forcing soldiers to kill their peers while others watched. Survivors were then shamed with harsh conditions, barley rations, sleeping outside defenses. The goal wasn't just punishment, but deterrence through public humiliation. Decimation weaponized peer pressure. One man's failure endangered 9 others, ensuring everyone policed each other. Even officers weren't exempt. Mark Antony included them in lots after a failed campaign. The randomness of death, regardless of bravery, bred paranoia, uniting units through shared fear. Used only after major failures, decimation was rare but devastating. The threat alone kept soldiers obedient for years, even in remote postings. While modern armies reject such cruelty, the core idea of group punishment still echoes today. Rome's true military genius wasn't just in battlefield tactics, it was in creating systems of control that turned fear into loyalty. Rome mastered warfare through ruthless efficiency, from the unstoppable testudo to the disintegrating wedge formation. Their tactics didn't just defeat enemies physically, but psychologically. Whether starving armies at Alesia or turning elephants against their own handlers, they found brutal solutions to every challenge. Even discipline became a weapon with punishments like decimation. Which tactic surprised you most? Was it the naval Corvus bridge or Caesar's double-walled siege ingenuity? Let us know in the comments. History's greatest armies deserve deeper examination, especially when their methods still influence warfare today.